What if everything you thought you knew about Aaliyah's death was a lie? What if her tragic plane crash wasn't an accident, but a meticulously orchestrated ritual, a sinister offering tied to an ancient entity, a hidden cabal, and her sacred bloodline? My name is Daniel Wells, and I uncovered the truth. Aaliyah wasn't just a star. She was chosen. Chosen not for her talent, not for her beauty, but for what ran through her veins. Her death wasn't about fame or fortune. It was about blood, lineage, and an unholy pact with something far older than we dare imagine. Her life was a chess piece in a game played by forces beyond human comprehension, a game that spans centuries and thrives in the shadows of fame. If you're hearing this, it means they've silenced me too, just like they silenced her. But the truth doesn't have to die with us. What I'm about to reveal will shatter everything you thought you knew about the music industry, the Order of the Veil, and the sinister rituals hidden behind the glitz and glamour. It's time to introduce you to... The case wasn't anything special, at least not at first. A husband thought his wife was cheating, and I was hired to find proof. I've handled cases like this 100 times before. Follow the suspect, take some photos, write a report. Clean, simple, boring. But this one didn't stay simple. I followed the woman to a storage facility on the outskirts of the city, the kind of place where secrets go to hide. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting sickly shadows on rows of rusted storage units. She wasn't alone. A man met her there, older, nervous. He handed her something, a small leather-bound journal. She clutched it like it was a lifeline. I stayed out of sight, snapping photos and filing the interaction away as leverage. Whatever was in that journal, it mattered to them. A lot. Later that night, my curiosity got the better of me. The woman didn't notice me tailing her to the bank downtown, where she rented a safety deposit box. She slipped the journal inside and left, her whole body radiating tension. Most cases, I'd let it end there. But something about this journal, the way they'd handled it, felt different. I pulled some strings, slipped the bank manager a generous bribe, and got access to her box. It wasn't the most ethical move, but it wasn't my first either. The journal was smaller than I'd expected, its leather cover cracked with age, the initials AH stamped into the corner. I opened it, the faint scent of old paper and perfume hitting me like a wave of memory. Flipping through the pages, my eyes landed on a name that stopped me cold. Aaliyah Houghton. It had been years since I'd last thought about her. Aaliyah, the girl with the voice that could quiet the world. Aaliyah, the star who burned too bright, gone too soon in that plane crash. The world had mourned her, and then, like it always does, it moved on. But as I held the journal, the world didn't feel so far away. The first few pages were innocuous, notes about recording sessions, scribbled lyrics, plans for upcoming projects. But as I flipped further, her tone shifted. The handwriting grew frantic, uneven. "They're always watching," one entry read. "I see them everywhere, at the shows, in the studios, even when I'm alone." She didn't name names, but there were enough cryptic references to send a chill down my spine. Mentions of strange men in suits, arguments overheard, shadows moving in the periphery of her vision. One entry stood out. "They're after something. Something I have. It's not just about the music. It's about me." The words were scratched into the page, the pen pressing so hard it tore the paper in places. I turned the page, but the next one was blank. In fact, several pages were blank, torn from the spine or burned around the edges. It was jarring, like hearing a sentence cut off mid-scream. Whatever had been written there, she or someone else had tried to erase it. I kept reading. The fragments grew darker. She mentioned symbols, strange objects she'd found left for her. An envelope of photos that made her sick to look at, a ring with a sigil she couldn't identify. Then there was the relic. They said it's the key, she wrote, but But the key to what? They think I don't know, but I've been reading. It has to be connected to blood. Mine. Why else would they be so interested in me? I paused, reading the line again. Blood. The word sat heavy on the page, underlined twice. I turned another page, but it was missing. More gaps, more empty spaces where the answers should have been. The next legible entry wasn't any clearer. I think they're trying to use me for something bigger than me, bigger than music. I found a name, the Order. They're behind it all, everything. And they won't stop until they get what they want. The Order? I frowned, flipping back and forth between the pages, looking for more clues. But the entries became erratic, the handwriting trailing off like a thought abandoned midstream. And then, the voice. Daniel. I froze, my breath catching in my chest. The word was faint, barely audible, but it was there. Daniel? It was soft, familiar, and achingly fragile. I looked around the room, but I was alone. The journal slipped from my fingers, landing on the desk with a dull thud. Find it, the voice whispered. Stop them. I stood there, staring at the journal, my heart hammering in my chest. It couldn't be real, it couldn't, but deep down, I knew. It was her. The diary wasn't just a journal, it was a map, a desperate attempt to make sense of a life spiraling out of control. But the missing pages, the gaps in her story, they haunted me. They hinted at something far darker than paranoia, something that reached beyond her life and possibly beyond mine. As I closed the journal and slid it into my bag, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Aaliyah had been trying to tell a story, but someone or something had made sure it stayed incomplete. I didn't know what I was walking into, but I had to find out. And if Aaliyah was right about them, about the Order, I wasn't sure I'd like what I found. The first night after I found the journal, I didn't sleep. It wasn't just the content of Aaliyah's entries, though those alone were enough to keep me up. No, it was something deeper, something I couldn't explain. A feeling that the air in my apartment had changed, that the shadows in the corners had grown thicker, darker. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw flashes, images that weren't mine. A plane descending too fast, fire in the sky, metal twisting like paper, and shadows. They stood at the edge of the wreckage, their faces obscured, their presence heavy with purpose, watching, waiting. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding, sweat pooling at the base of my neck. The clock on my nightstand blinked 3:12 a.m. I ran my hands through my hair, trying to shake the images from my mind, but the unease lingered. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe I shouldn't have taken the journal. But it was more than that. The whisper started just as I was beginning to convince myself it was nothing. Faint, barely audible, like voices carried on a breeze that wasn't there. I froze, straining to listen. They were coming from the desk where I'd left the journal. I crossed the room cautiously, the floorboards creaking beneath my bare feet. The journal sat exactly where I'd left it, its cracked leather cover catching the faint glow of the street lamp outside. But as I drew closer, the whispers stopped. My pulse quickened. I reached out, hesitating for a moment before picking it up. The journal was cold, colder than it should have been. My fingers brushed over the initials, a H, and for a split second, I thought I felt the faintest vibration. I opened it to the page I'd marked earlier, the one where Aaliyah had written about the relic. Her handwriting stared back at me, erratic and hurried. They said it's the key, but the key to what? They think I don't know, but I've been reading. It has to be connected to blood. Mine. Why else would they be so interested in me? The words seemed different now, heavier somehow, like they were pressing down on me, demanding to be understood. The phone rang, shattering the silence. I jumped, the journal slipping from my hands and landing on the desk with a thud. Christ, I muttered, running a hand over my face. I grabbed the phone, my voice sharper than I intended. Hello? For a moment there was nothing, just static, faint and crackling. And then, Daniel, my blood ran cold. The voice was soft, trembling, and painfully familiar. Aaliyah? I whispered. Find it, she said. Stop them. The line went dead. I stood there, the phone still pressed to my ear, my mind reeling. It couldn't have been her. It wasn't possible. But the voice, it was hers. The whispers returned, louder now, like they were right behind me. I spun around expecting to see someone, but the room was empty. The journal lay open on the desk, its pages fluttering slightly, though there was no breeze. I approached it cautiously, every nerve in my body screaming at me to leave it alone. The pages had turned to a new entry, one I hadn't seen before. The handwriting was jagged, the ink smudged as if written in a panic. I don't know who to trust anymore. I can feel them closing in. The Order knows I've been researching them. They know I'm getting closer. If anything happens to me, it's because of the relic, because of what it means, because of what I am. What I am. The words echoed in my mind, their weight heavy with implications I didn't yet understand. I closed the journal, my hands trembling, and backed away. The whispers faded, leaving only the sound of my own breathing. The air in the room felt suffocating, thick with something I couldn't name. I didn't sleep that night. By morning, I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just a journal. It wasn't just a case. Whatever I'd stumbled into, it was bigger than me. Bigger than anything I'd ever imagined. And if Aaliyah was right, it wasn't going to stop. By the time the sun rose, I was a mess. My head was pounding, my hands shaking, and my apartment felt like it was closing in on me. The journal sat on my desk, silent now, as though it hadn't spent the night whispering to me in the dark. I didn't want to look at it again, but I didn't have a choice. Something about it wouldn't let me go. After a cold shower and 3 cups of coffee, I sat down at the desk and opened the journal again, this time with a fresh notepad beside me. I needed to make sense of this, if not for Aaliyah's sake, then for my own sanity. The first thing I did was catalog the missing pages. They weren't random, the gaps were deliberate. Each blank section seemed to interrupt a thought, leaving just enough to hint at something bigger. I tried to piece together a timeline based on the entries that remained. In the beginning, Aaliyah wrote like she was trying to figure things out. Her notes were speculative, her language hesitant. She talked about symbols she'd seen, strange conversations with executives, and a growing feeling that she was being watched. But then her tone changed. Somewhere in the middle, she stopped speculating and started panicking. They know, she wrote. They know I've been looking. I don't know how much longer I have. The later entries were fragmented, paranoid, and full of references to the Order. I spent the morning researching. The Order wasn't much to go on, but I'd seen stranger leads turn into something real. After a few hours of digging, I found whispers about a group called the Order of the Black Veil. They were supposed to be a myth, a secret society that had infiltrated industries around the world, controlling wealth, power, and influence from the shadows. The more I read, the more absurd it sounded. Sacrifices, rituals, summoning ancient gods. This wasn't the kind of thing that belonged in the real world. It belonged in horror movies and conspiracy forums. But Aaliyah believed in them. She believed they were real. And then there was the relic. Her description of the relic nagged at me. It was vague, a small object, covered in symbols, terrifying to touch. But it wasn't the kind of thing you'd forget if you'd seen it. If it was real, someone had to know something about it. I decided to start with the easiest lead I had, the storage facility. I arrived at the facility around midday. It looked even worse in daylight. Rust streaked the metal doors. Weeds pushed through cracks in the concrete, and the faint hum of fluorescent lights gave everything a sickly, artificial glow. I'd been here just the day before, tailing the woman who'd stashed the journal. Now I was back, pretending I had every right to be here. The manager was a wiry guy with sunken eyes and a smoker's cough. It didn't take much to get him talking. A few bills slipped across the counter, and he was happy to tell me everything I wanted to know. Unit 47, he said, pointing down the row, belongs to a guy named Gerald Marks. Comes by maybe once a month, always looking over his shoulder. Not my business, though. Gerald Marks. I didn't recognize the name, but it didn't matter. If he was connected to the journal, I needed to know why. The lock on the unit was a cheap one. It gave way after a few seconds with the help of a tension wrench and a pick. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with the smell of dust and mildew. The space was packed with boxes, each labeled in neat handwriting. I started with the ones closest to the door, flipping through files, photos, and old papers. Most of it seemed like junk, but then I found a folder marked Veil. Inside were photos of symbols, intricate looping designs etched into stone, wood, and even skin. One of the photos showed a ring with a sigil carved into it. My stomach dropped. It was exactly like the one Aaliyah had described in her journal. There were notes too, written in the same neat handwriting as the labels. They mentioned rights, bloodlines, and the old one. The old one. It was the first time I'd seen those words, but they stuck with me. There was something about them, something heavy, something wrong. I packed up the folder, taking a few photos for good measure, and stepped back into the sunlight. For a moment, I felt like I could breathe again. And then the whispers came back. They were louder this time, clearer, like they were right beside me. Daniel? I turned, but the lot was empty. Find it. I clenched my fists, trying to steady my breathing. The voice was hers. I didn't know how it was possible, but I knew it was her. Aaliyah, I whispered. What are you trying to tell me? The whispers faded, leaving me alone with the sound of my own heartbeat. Whatever this was, it wasn't over. The ride back to my apartment was uneventful, at least on the surface, but inside, I was unraveling. My hands gripped the steering wheel too tight, knuckles pale against the faded leather. The whispers had stopped after the storage lot, but they lingered in my mind, the ghost of a voice that shouldn't exist. Daniel. Her voice. Aaliyah's voice. It had been years, but I couldn't forget it. It was soft, melodic, yet trembling with urgency. How was this possible? The journal sat on the passenger seat, the weight of it pulling at me. I glanced at it every few seconds, as though it might spring to life. Back in my apartment, I spread everything out on the desk. The journal, the photos I'd taken from the storage unit, the notes from the folder labeled Veil. The room was dim, the blinds drawn to keep the world out. The photos drew me in first. Each one felt heavier than the last. Symbols etched into stone tablets, carved into wooden idols, and tattooed onto flesh. One image showed a symbol surrounded by words I couldn't read, the language foreign and ancient. I grabbed my notepad, copying the shapes and patterns as best I could. Maybe someone would know what they meant. The notes from the folder were next. They were meticulous, the handwriting precise and clean. Phrases like rites of ascension and chosen bloodlines leapt out at me. But it was one passage in particular that stopped me cold. The key resides within the vessel. Only the bloodline may awaken the slumbering one. The bloodline. My pulse quickened. Aaliyah had written about her blood in the journal, hadn't she? Something about how they were interested in her, not just for her music, but for who she was. I flipped open the journal, scanning her entries again. They said the relic is the key. But the key to what? They think I don't know, but I've been reading. It has to be connected to blood. Mine. My hands trembled as I read the words. What had she meant? Was it paranoia? Or was there something more to this? Something darker? The gaps in her journal haunted me. I ran my fingers over the torn edges as if touching them would somehow bring the missing words back. Why would someone remove pages from her diary? Was it her? Or someone else? A thought struck me. If Aaliyah had felt she was being watched, she might have destroyed some of the entries herself. But why leave the rest? Why let someone, me, find them. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. The journal wasn't just a record, it was a puzzle, and the missing pieces were just as important as the ones that remained. That night, I dreamt of water. It started with a faint ripple, the surface calm and unbroken. But then the waves grew, crashing against jagged rocks. The water turned black, thick like oil, and something moved beneath it, massive, powerful, unseen. And then I heard it, the whispers. They grew louder, more insistent, echoing in the hollow recesses of my mind. I turned, but there was nothing there, only shadows that stretched and twisted as if alive. "Daniel," her voice again, calling to me. It wasn't just in my head. It felt real, as though she were standing just beyond the edge of the dream. "Find it," she said. "They're coming." I woke with a gasp, my chest heaving, the sheets tangled around me. My clock read 3:33 a.m. The journal was on my desk, exactly where I'd left it. But now, one of the photos lay on top of it, a close-up of a symbol carved into stone. I didn't remember putting it there. By morning, I was back in investigator mode. The strange, unexplainable events were piling up, but I couldn't let them derail me. I needed answers. I took the journal and the copied symbols to an old contact of mine, a professor of anthropology who specialized in ancient cultures. Professor Whitaker had seen more than his fair share of strange artifacts over the years, but when I handed him the journal and the photos, even he paused. "This," he said, tracing his finger over one of the copied symbols, "is old. Very old. I'd say predating any organized civilization we know of." "What does it mean?" I asked. He adjusted his glasses, frowning. "I can't say for sure, but if I had to guess, I'd say it's a seal. Something meant to keep something contained." "Contained? Or restrained?" he said, leaning back in his chair. "Whatever it is, it's not something you'd want to let out." The words settled over me like a weight. As I left the university, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. The streets were busy with lunchtime crowds, but every time I glanced over my shoulder, I saw him. A man in a black coat, his face obscured by the brim of a hat. He didn't get too close, but he didn't fall behind either. I ducked into a cafe, watching through the window as he passed by. He didn't stop, but I knew he wasn't gone. They were watching me now. Just like Aaliyah said, the walk back to my apartment felt like a lifetime. The man in the black coat hadn't followed me out of the cafe, but his presence lingered in my mind. Every shadow, every face in the crowd seemed suspicious now. Aaliyah's words rang in my ears. "They're watching you." When I got home, the apartment felt different, off, like someone had been there. I double-checked the locks, the windows, the closet. Everything was where I left it, except the journal. It was open on the desk, its pages fluttering slightly in the breeze from the open window. I didn't leave the window open. I approached the desk cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. The journal was open to a blank page, or at least it should have been blank. But faintly, as though written in smoke, words began to appear. "It's not just my blood, it's the line." The ink darkened as I watched, the words solidifying on the page. "They think I'm the only one, but I've been reading. There are others. The relic calls to them too." My breath caught in my throat. The words didn't make sense. Or maybe they made too much sense. Aaliyah thought she wasn't alone. The references to her bloodline, to others who might share her fate, they lined up too perfectly with the professor's analysis of the symbols. The order wasn't just after Aaliyah, they were after anyone connected to this line, including me. The air in the room grew heavy, and the faint hum of whispers started again. This time, they weren't coming from the journal. They were in my head. "Daniel." Her voice was softer now, less urgent, but no less real. "You have to find it," she said. "The relic. It's the only way." I tried to speak, but the words caught in my throat. The whispers swirled around me, pulling me deeper into the sound. Images flashed in my mind. waves crashing against jagged cliffs, an altar carved with strange symbols, and a small black object glowing faintly under the moonlight. I snapped back to reality, gasping for air. The journal was closed now, the faint hum of whispers gone. I spent the rest of the night piecing together the timeline. Aaliyah's journal was fragmented, but with the notes from the storage unit, I started to see the outline of her final days. She'd been on edge during the weeks leading up to her trip to the Bahamas. The symbols had started appearing everywhere, on envelopes left in her dressing room, etched into the walls of studio buildings, even burned into the surface of a recording desk. She'd written about the relic again, mentioning that someone had left it for her during a recording session. They said it was a gift, but it felt like a curse. The moment I touched it, I knew it wasn't just an object. It was alive. The final entries were chaotic, fragmented. She wrote about the order openly now, describing men who followed her, threats whispered in passing, and the growing certainty that her life was no longer her own. Then, nothing. The pages after that were either blank or torn out entirely. Aaliyah wasn't the only one. The more I read, the more certain I became that the order was targeting her because of something deeper, her bloodline. The professor had been right. The symbols in the photos weren't just for summoning something. They were seals, designed to keep whatever it was contained, but they needed blood to break the seals. Not just any blood, mine. I didn't know how or why, but the pieces were coming together. The dreams, the whispers, the way Aaliyah's voice reached out to me through the journal. It wasn't a coincidence. I had to find the relic. Gerald Marks, the man who owned the storage unit, was my next lead. His name appeared in the journal once, scrawled in the margin of a page, Marks knows. He's the one who brought it to me. Tracking him down wasn't hard. A quick search of public records led me to a warehouse on the industrial side of town. The place was a fortress, high fences topped with razor wire, security cameras at every corner, and a single guard patrolling the perimeter. Getting in wasn't going to be easy, but I didn't have a choice. The whispers started again as I approached the fence, faint but insistent. "Daniel, hurry." I gritted my teeth, shaking my head to clear the sound. I didn't know if I was going insane or if this was real, but either way I was committed. Breaking in was easier than I expected. The security cameras were real, but the guard wasn't paying much attention. I slipped through a side door, my heart pounding as I stepped into the cavernous space. The warehouse was filled with crates and shelves, most of them marked with strange symbols I recognized from the photos. The air was thick with the smell of dust and something else, something metallic, like blood. I moved cautiously, scanning the labels on the crates. One caught my attention immediately. Relic number 47, Vale Archive. The crate was nailed shut, but a crowbar lay nearby. I pried it open, the wood splintering as the lid gave way. Inside was a small black object, no bigger than my palm. Its surface was smooth and cold, etched with intricate patterns that seemed to shift under the flickering light. The moment I touched it, everything changed. A rush of heat shot through me, and my vision blurred. I staggered back, clutching the relic as images flooded my mind. Aaliyah, standing on a rocky shore, the wind whipping her hair. A group of figures in black robes surrounding her, chanting in a language I didn't understand. Blood dripping onto the altar, the relic glowing brighter with each drop. And then, her voice. "Daniel." It wasn't just a plea. It was something more, something deeper. I saw her eyes, wide and filled with terror, and for the first time, I understood. Aaliyah hadn't just been chosen. She'd been marked. And now, so was I. The relic pulsed in my hand, its surface cold but alive, as if it had a heartbeat of its own. The visions faded, leaving me trembling in the dark silence of the warehouse. My breath came in short gasps, and my mind raced to process what I'd just seen. Aaliyah's face, her voice, her terror, it all made sense now. The order didn't just kill her, they needed her. Her blood, her lineage, Her connection to something ancient and powerful was central to their plans. And now I knew why I'd been drawn into this. I shoved the relic into my bag and turned to leave. But the sound of footsteps stopped me cold. Shadows moved across the far wall, and I ducked behind a stack of crates, my heart hammering in my chest. "They'll know he's been here," a deep voice said. "The relic's gone. He has it," another replied. I didn't wait to hear more. I moved quickly, weaving through the maze of crates toward the exit. But the whispers started again, louder this time, almost deafening. "Daniel, don't run!" Her voice stopped me in my tracks. The room seemed to tilt, the shadows growing longer, darker, as if the warehouse itself were alive. "They're coming," she said, her voice echoing in my mind. "You have to stop them. You're the only one who can." I hadn't slept in days. Every step I took felt like it carried a shadow of dread, and the weight of the relic in my bag only grew heavier. I kept moving. Different cities, different motels, always looking over my shoulder. But it didn't matter. They were coming for me, and I knew it. I just locked the door of another cheap motel when I heard the whisper of footsteps outside. My heart sank. There was no time to run. The door splintered, and they came in. A dozen men in black robes, their faces obscured by hoods. Their leader stepped forward, his voice calm but filled with menace. "Daniel," he said, "you've carried it long enough. Give us the relic." I backed into the corner of the room, clutching the bag tighter. The relic seemed to pulse harder, like it knew it was close to being found. "You don't know what you're dealing with," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I've seen what it can do. If you summon him—" "We're not summoning," the leader interrupted, his tone sharp. "We're completing what should never have been interrupted." He gestured, and two of his men stepped forward. They held ropes, chains, something to bind me. But as they approached, the relic began to glow faintly, its intricate symbols radiating an eerie light. They stopped in their tracks, their hesitation betraying fear. The leader sneered. "It's reacting to you, just like it did to her." He stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "You're the Bloodline, Daniel. You always were." They didn't kill me, not immediately. Instead, I was dragged to an abandoned church on the outskirts of town. The windows were shattered, the pews rotted, but the altar had been cleared, its surface covered in black cloth and symbols etched in crimson. They placed the relic at the center, and the leader began to chant. I struggled against my bonds, but the ropes dug into my wrists. I could feel the air shift, the temperature drop. The shadows in the room seemed to grow darker, thicker, like they were alive. "You're making a mistake," I shouted. "You don't know what you're bringing into this world." The leader ignored me, his voice rising as he recited words I couldn't understand. The relic glowed brighter, and the room filled with a low, resonating hum. The relic's light turned blinding, and then it cracked, a jagged fissure splitting its surface. A wave of heat surged through the room, and the air was filled with the sound of 1,000 screams. From the fissure emerged him. Baphomet's form defied comprehension. His goat-like head loomed high above, his horns curling like ancient roots reaching for the heavens. His eyes were pits of fire, his gaze burning with hatred and dominance. The flesh of his face seemed to writhe and shift, like molten rock forced into a terrible shape. His body was an abomination of sinew and bone, his arms ending in clawed hands that dripped with a black, tar-like substance. His wings stretched wide, casting the room into shadow, each feather jagged and razor-sharp. The sound that emanated from him was deafening, a cacophony of roars, screams, and whispers that seemed to pierce the soul. Every breath he took was heavy with power, the kind that made the world itself seem fragile. Baphomet's gaze fell upon the altar, where the relic lay shattered. The order fell to their knees, their chants turning to desperate pleas. "We have brought you forth, Great One," the leader said, his voice trembling. "We offer you the bloodline to complete the bond." Baphomet turned his burning gaze to me. The weight of it pressed against my chest, and I could barely breathe. He took a step forward, the ground cracking beneath him. But then his gaze shifted to the remnants of the relic. The shattered pieces glowed faintly, their light flickering like the last gasp of a dying flame. Baphomet let out a low growl, his voice reverberating through the room. The room erupted into chaos. The Order scrambled, their once solemn ritual turning into a desperate attempt to escape. Baphomet's wrath was unrelenting. His clawed hands struck down the robed figures, their screams cut short as they were consumed by shadows. In the chaos, my bonds loosened. The relic, or what was left of it, seemed to call to me. I grabbed the largest shard, its surface still glowing faintly, and ran. Baphomet's roar followed me as I burst through the church doors, the cold night air hitting my face. Behind me, the church collapsed, swallowed by darkness and flames. I didn't stop running until I reached the cliffs. My hands were still trembling, the shard of the relic warm against my skin. The significance of the day hit me then, December 25th, the Lord's Day. This wasn't a coincidence. The irony was sharp and deliberate. The day meant for hope and salvation had been twisted by the Order into one of control and sacrifice. But now it was the only reason I was still alive. The Lord's Day wasn't just a mark on a calendar, it was a shield, a divine reminder that false prophets and false gods could never truly win. Aaliyah had written about it in her journal. She'd quoted Matthew 24:24. "For there shall be false Christs and false prophets, and they shall rise and deceive many." The Order wasn't just summoning an ancient force. They were creating a mockery of salvation, a false Christ to take its place. But today, they had failed. Back in my apartment, I sat at the desk, Aaliyah's journal in front of me. Its pages were blank now, as though the secrets had burned away with the relic. But I didn't need them anymore. I felt her presence again, faint but unshakable, as though she was standing just behind me, quiet but resolute. She wasn't gone, not entirely. "We'll take them down," I said aloud, not to myself, but to her. "We'll expose every last one of them." The air shifted, the faintest ripple passing through the room. Her approval, perhaps, her agreement. And then, softly, so softly I almost missed it, she spoke. R. Kelly. The name hung in the air like a curse, like a promise. The lights flickered, and the faint hum of whispers returned. Aaliyah was still here, and together, we were just getting started.